Dynamite announced a bunch of fights for the UFC 308 Abu Dhabi pay-per-view card. Hours before last weekend's fight night between Cory Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov, which was also in Abu Dhabi by the way. This pay-per-view card is better than the UFC 300 pay-per-view card, and it is not even close by the way. So how come this random pay-per-view card in Abu Dhabi be better than UFC 300, the greatest event of all times, pay-per-view card? Well, this is not an accident, but a well thought out decision for certain reasons. I'll go through the announced fight list first, and then I'll get into those reasons. First fight that was announced, Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway. This is a great fight. Ilia Topuria is coming after his knockout victory over Alexander Volkanovski, and Max Holloway is coming after his very own knockout victory over Justin Gaethje that took place in UFC 300. And my pick is Ilia Topuria. Max Holloway is a great technical fighter, and he has one of the best fight IQs we have ever seen inside the octagon. But he has had some fights in the past that were closer than we expected. The fight between him and Yair Rodriguez and Arnold Allen was a bit too closer to my liking, and I think Ilia Topuria is a better version of both of these fighters, Arnold Allen and Rodriguez. And Ilia Topuria is great when it comes to his fight adaptability, and we saw him utilize this against his fights over Jai Herbert, Josh Emmett and Alexander Volkanovski. And even in the worst case scenario, Ilia Topuria can use his grappling skills because Ilia Topuria started as a grappler, then transitioned into the striker we know today. I think this is a close fight, a closer fight than many people anticipate it to be, but I would still give the edge to Ilia Topuria. Also, Alexander Volkanovski had an interview with ESPN back in June, and he said whatever his next fight is going to be, it's going to be for the title, meaning the winner of Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway is most likely going to defend their belt against Alexander Volkanovski. This is not a fight prediction video. I do my fight prediction videos right after the weighings of each event so that I can bottle up all the available informations up to the weighing and then finally make my decision after I see the fighter on the scale. And the fight prediction video for this weekend's fight night between Spivak and Tibura is coming Friday night after the weighings. Now compare this main event to UFC 300's main event, Alex Peirera versus Jamal Hill. Don't get me wrong, this was a great main event. Alex Peirera is coming after his victory over Jan Blachowicz, who was the only man, at least at that time, before Alex, who managed to beat Israel Adesanya, his former rivalry. And Jamal Hill is coming after his record-breaking victory over Glover Teixeira, who's a friend of Alex Pereira and is one of his grappling coaches. So there was this storyline leading up to that fight. But comparing that to Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway, both of whom are at the peak of their popularity and also peak of their career, I would say. I would say this pay-per-view event in Abu Dhabi has a really solid main event that goes on par with the UFC 300 main event. And keep in mind, UFC 300 was the greatest UFC event of all time. And this is a random pay-per-view card in Abu Dhabi. The second fight that was announced was Cyril Gane versus Alexander Volkov. They're actually fighting for the second time. They fought all the way back in 27th of June 2021, and Gane won that fight via unanimous decision. It's important to mention that even though the fight was won by Cyril Gane via unanimous decision, the fight was closely contested by Alexander Volkov. Cyril Gane clearly won, but it was a competitive fight. And if you compare what both of these fighters have been doing for the last couple of years, Alexander Volkov has been fighting good competition consistently and getting better at his game over and over again, whereas Cyril Gane has been inactive and shooting movies in Europe. Because of their experience over the last year and a half, and also the fact that the first fight was competitive, I am going to give the edge to Alexander Volkov. Now let's compare this to the co-main event of UFC 300, Weili Zhang versus Yang Xiangnon. UFC 308 co-main event is much better than Weili versus Yang. And yes, on paper it was a much better fight because it's a title fight for the women's strawweight title, but comparing pure entertainment value and the hype for the build-up, I would say Cyril Gane versus Alexander Volkov is a much better entertaining fight. Just for the record, I'm not sure if Cyril Gane versus Alexander Volkov is going to be the core main event of 308, but even if it wasn't, the third fight that was announced would still be better than Yan versus Weili, and that fight is Khamzat Chimaev versus Robert Whittaker. This fight was initially meant to happen in UFC Abu Dhabi, but Khamzat Chimaev pulled out of this fight due to violent illness, and Robert Whittaker went on to fight Ikram Alaskrov, which he, got the knockout victory, which is good. And the fight is rescheduled. And to be honest with you, this mostly depends on if it is a 3-round fight or a 5-round fight. If it's a 3-round fight, I am confident in Khamzat Chimaev. If it's a 5-round fight, I would be less confident. I think I would still go with Khamzat, but I would do my full fight breakdown closer to the event. But Robert has a good chance of victory for this fight. It's pretty funny because Robert Whittaker has had some really good performances over the last year and a half, whereas Khamzat Chimaev has been inactive, pulling out of fights and doing crypto scams. Khamzat Chimaev is a crypto scammer. Who would have thought? And I made a video breaking down exactly what happened and how Khamzat and his crypto team managed to scam his fans. And I'll link that video in the description. And I'll also make sure to remind you at the end of this video so that you can go ahead and watch that video too. I'm still going with Khamzat Chimaev, don't get me wrong, but I'm pretty confident with Robert Whittaker too. Here's a fun fact about this UFC 308 Abu Dhabi pay-per-view card. This event is going to be on local time of Abu Dhabi, whereas the last UFC pay-per-view event was not on local time, resulting in the Manchester fans having to start the event at 12 AM and then watch the main event all the way at 6 AM, 7 AM, 8 AM. And obviously, unsurprisingly, a good portion of the fans were sleeping during the fights. Now let's add the other fights that were announced. Magomed Ankalaev versus Alexander Rakic, Dan Ige versus Leron Murphy. This is one of the best pay-per-view cards we have ever seen, and it is easily better than the UFC 300 pay-per-view card. I want to make the distinction, the pay-per-view card, alright? UFC 300 was the better event. I mean, we had main card headliners of other pay-per-view and fight night events headlining prelims and early prelims in UFC 300. It was an insane event, but comparing just the pay-per-view cards, UFC 308 got the better pay-per-view card. Now, why is this? Why is this random pay-per-view card in Abu Dhabi got one of the most insane lineups we have ever seen? And why is it on local time? And why is it better than the Las Vegas Sphere card, UFC 306, that the UFC has been hyping up for a real long time, only to be disappointing? What's going on? The answer to that is pretty simple. The answer is Abu Dhabi or the Abu Dhabi government. UFC and Abu Dhabi government has had a close relationship with each other for a really long time. Believe this or not, Abu Dhabi government, not a private company or a government-related company, but no, the government-owned company called Flash Entertainment, which is basically Abu Dhabi government, owned 10% of the UFC all the way from 2009 all the way to 2016. So not only did Abu Dhabi government had close relationships with the UFC, Abu Dhabi government basically owned 10% of the UFC until 2016. And now fast forward to the COVID time, where Abu Dhabi government partnered up with the UFC to have the fight island during the pandemic. The relationship only grew stronger, and these pay-per-view events and fight nights UFC have been doing over at Abu Dhabi are not just events but results of these partnerships, meaning UFC is getting paid a huge ton of money to have these events in Abu Dhabi. UFC is getting paid somewhere around $25 million just to have one event in Abu Dhabi. Considering this is a pay-per-view event and this information has been public for quite a long time, I am going to assume the number is much higher than $25 million for this UFC 308 pay-per-view card. When UFC is having their events in England, English government is not paying the UFC. When the UFC is having their event in Brazil, Brazilian government isn't paying the UFC. But when UFC is having their events in Abu Dhabi government is paying them well over $25 million to have those events in their country. Not only does the UFC have the financial incentive, UFC also has the pressure to uphold their partnerships and agreements in place. Regardless of what happens, UFC is going to put good events in Abu Dhabi. This is not just exclusive to Abu Dhabi. UFC also get a side fee from Saudi Arabian government and also Australia. So this is not just a Middle East thing. Australia also, I'm pretty sure, paying UFC $15 million to have UFC events in Australia. So they get a side fee that is 8 figures. UFC has no option but to do really good events in those countries. And to be completely honest with you, I have no problem with this. I generally have no problem with this because the events are good and I am a UFC fan and I love the sport of MMA. Only thing I want is to watch really good UFC events on a Saturday night. That's really all I want to do. So I don't really care if they're getting paid a side fee or not. The only problem I would have is if they were to slack off and put mediocre pay-per-view and fighting events in other places just to stack up these, Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia pay-per-views. Apex cards were always mediocre and we have had some solid pay-per-views and fight nights all throughout the year so far, so no complaints. As long as UFC stays consistent with their quality all throughout their pay-per-views and majority of their fight nights, I have no problem with this. I love the UFC, I just want to see some really good fights on Saturday nights, and that's what I'm here for. And if you like this video, I make multiple UFC videos every week and it would mean a lot to me if you could subscribe. Then you will see my future videos and I can continue to make these videos. And remember when I told you about Hamza Chimaev's crypto scam? Well, here's the video if you want to watch that. And here's my Twitter and I'll see you soon with my this weekend's fight prediction video.